Welcome to Tales of Teltra by D.H. McCormack. Episode 2. In the spring, Nura and Pin loved to run through the fields at dusk. The new grass was long and wet, and Nura would go barefoot, eager to feel the cool softness under her soles. Pin would disappear into the grass, muzzle first, sniffing out the field mice, with her orange fur and bushy white tail becoming a barely visible flash in the dimming light. In summer, they loved the taste of cherries from the family orchard, and the cool stone floor under the kitchen table where they would hide from the midday heat. The cooler evenings were spent following Nura's older brother, Yale, out on patrol along the aisles of fruit trees. At least once a week, the Sandhit brothers would come scrumping with one of the other boys from the village, but more often than not they were sent running, Nura and Yale pelting them with stones as Pin nipped at their heels. In autumn they loved the harvest songs and the way the hard green pears turned soft and yellow gold. The days were long and the work hard, as even young Nura was expected to take a break from her schooling and help to bring in the crops of pears and damson plums. By evening she was exhausted and would doze by the fire as the adults sang thanks for the peace and drank small glasses of clear pear brandy. Pin would rest her head on Nura's lap, eyes half closed and red tongue lolling out the corner of her mouth between her white fangs which glinted in the firelight. All these things Nura and Pin loved, but most of all they loved what came with the winter. Long evenings, a warm fire, and Father with his dog Beor. Father spent most of the year coming and going, living out in the old wood for weeks on end, tending to the wild places there. The shorter days and colder nights, however, would bring him home for a whole glorious season. After the sun had set and the night closed in, Father would fill his creaking chair next to the fire, light his pipe, and sit there contentedly while Nura and Mother sang the songs of the old country. As evening wore on, they would turn to stories or idle chat, and Nura would climb up into her father's lap and refuse to leave. She would lay there, quiet and happy, listening to Yale recite poetry or Doll trying to join in, and all the while Father would stroke her hair lovingly, only stopping occasionally to relight his pipe. When bedtime came, Nura would shut her eyes tight and pretend to be asleep. Father would sigh, then have to pick her up and carry her to her room. Nura would press in close to him as he grunted and struggled with her up the narrow stairway. "You're getting too big for this," he would say each evening, and each evening Nura would hold on to him all the tighter until he laid her gently in her bed, kissed her on her forehead, and tucked her in beneath her covers. Pin would pat into the room, orange fur rich in the candle light, and curl up at the foot of her bed. Door closed and candle snuffed out, both would drift off to sleep and dream of cherry-stained fingers, open fields, and the smell of the rich earth. It was the morning of Nura's 8th birthday, and she lay in her bed watching the light of the late autumn sunrise travel slowly across her ceiling. Pin was already off somewhere across the fields. Nura got glimpses of towering grasses and trees, the scent of a hare, the coiled tension in Pin's body as she approached from downwind. Nura grimaced as Pin pounced. She let the bond fade into the recesses of her awareness. She would never get used to the feeling of Pin hunting. Still, it was the way of things, she supposed, and she did not resent Pin for being what she was, a fox that needed to eat. Nura rolled out of bed and threw on her favorite yellow dress, then headed downstairs with her long dark hair tangled like a bird's nest at the back of her head and rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, and Nura could hear her mother singing from the kitchen down the dimly lit hallway. Nura pushed open the kitchen door. Sunlight poured in through the 2 large sash windows, bathing the room in a golden hue. Kirel, Mother's cat, purred on the windowsill, eyes half closed and tail dangling, swishing it this way and that as Doll crouched on the floor, batting at it and laughing. The long table in the center of the room was already laid with breads, jams, and preserves, and in the middle sat a blue vase filled with Nura's favorite flowers, lowland garthias, with blossoms like clusters of tiny bright orange trumpets. Her mother, Hita, looked up and smiled as Nura entered the room, then left the kettle atop the wood-fired stove and walked over to gently cup Nura's cheeks. Flour was on her mother's hands and apron, and her curly dark hair was tied back with a blue headscarf.
"Look at my big, beautiful girl. 8 years old," she said, looking Nura up and down. "I keep telling you to stop growing, but do you listen to your mother?"
Nura wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. "Morning, Mama," she mumbled as Yael came in through the back door. "Oh, look at this spread. Must be someone's birthday," he said with a grin and winked at Nura as he took his seat at the table. Steam hissed from the kettle on the stove, and Hita hurried back over to it, taking it from the heat with a folded tea towel. More people were coming into the kitchen now. Jesse, the shepherd's son, who was the same age as Nura, and Mira, the kitchen maid, followed closely by her husband, Hal, the farmhand. The sound of conversation bubbled merrily, and there was a scraping of chairs and clack of crockery on wood as they all took their places and Hita finished laying the table, then filled each person's cup in turn with the steaming amber tea. Finally, she poured her own cup, then the one at the empty place next to her, and took her seat. True to custom, they always poured Father's cup, even when he was away, a prayer for a safe journey and his swift return. Nura wondered where in the old wood he was now, and what he was doing, and when she would see him again. "Peace, we welcome you this day," Hita intoned as she lifted her cup. "May peace be wrought through the work of our hands." "The work of our hands," everyone replied in unison, then sipped from their own cups. Father's tea remained on the table, undisturbed, steam curling upwards from its surface. There was a brief silence and everyone was still. Then the meal began as they all tucked in, cutting the bread and spreading it with butter and dollops of tart jam. Nura, however, remained motionless. A familiar scent had come wafting into the back of her mind. Damp earth and sweet tobacco mingled with wet dog. She jumped up, knocking her chair backwards. "Pin?" She reached out silently, giving her full focus to the bond. "Nura, what are you doing?" Her mother scolded, and everyone stopped eating and turned to look at her, but Nura barely noticed. Pin was running downhill towards the farm. Across the field, she could see 2 figures making their way along the east road, coming in from the old wood. In a heartbeat, Nura was out the back door, running barefoot through the farmyard and out onto the track, heading east. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears, keeping time with the quick thud of her feet. She slowed slightly as the path rose, then crested the small hill and saw them coming up the other side, Father and Beor. She ran and leapt into her father's arms at full pelt, hearing him grunt as she wrapped her arms and legs around him. He was wet, dirty, unshaven, and wonderful. "You came! You never come on my birthday!" Nura exclaimed as she held him tight. "My sweet girl," he laughed and kissed her cheek, scratching her with his rough beard. "Happy birthday! Here, let me look at you." He put her down and crouched in front of her, holding her shoulders. "I have missed you," he said. "How is your mother? Dal, Yael?" "Good," Nura replied. "Mama just finished pouring the tea." "Well, we had better get home quick then. Shouldn't keep everyone waiting," Father replied, then stood and lifted Nura onto his shoulders. They set off homeward, Father walking quickly with long, loping strides. Nura felt like she was a small bird perched in the upper branches of a young tree. She swayed back and forth with each step he took, looking out over the hedgerows and fields. Pin appeared on the track ahead and ran up to nuzzle Beor in greeting. The whole rest of the way home, she darted back and forth excitedly until they reached the farmhouse gate where Mother was waiting for them. "Alith?" The shock in her voice was plain, but excitement danced in her eyes. "How were you able to come back so soon?" she asked as she put her arm about his neck and kissed him. "What a wonderful surprise!" What father wouldn't be sad to always miss his girl's birthday? I figured it wouldn't hurt just this once, he said, and patted Nora's knee. Besides, it is good for Juhan to get some experience out there alone. Oh, and there is some news to share, but later. A question flickered across Hita's face, then was gone. Well, you are just in time for breakfast, she replied. Excellent timing, as ever. Perhaps your tea is still hot? Everyone gathered round as they came into the kitchen, and Yale and Dahl hugged their father excitedly. Father took a slip of paper from his pack and pressed it into Yale's hand, speaking softly into his ear. Yale nodded, then without a word put on his boots and hurried out into the yard, where his large Shire horse Hanat was already waiting for him. Nura watched, confused, as her brother rode out of the yard and turned westward. Sorry, Nura, her father said, as they all returned to the table. An important message. He shouldn't be long. Let's make sure we save him some of this wonderful breakfast, eh? Nura grinned and nodded. Shortly, the room was full of laughter as everyone ate, and Hall gave an animated account of Nura shooting up and out the door like an arrow. Nura beamed as she watched her father, tired and still in his damp traveling clothes, yet happy as he listened and sat amongst his family once more. It was near noon when Yale returned home accompanied by the chief steward, Sandir. Throughout the morning, dark clouds had rolled in from the Uldir Mountains in the north, and rain now lashed down in thick sheets, soaking Nura's brother and their guests to the bone. Nura watched from the bottom step of the stairs as father and mother greeted Sandir at the front door and ushered him quickly inside, while Yale took the horses round to the stables. In all the years we have known one another, Sandir said as he peeled off his leather overcoat, I never received a message from you like this one. He held up the damp piece of paper between his two ring fingers. Strange times call for strange messages, father replied and embraced his old friend. Father had often told Nura of how he and Sandir had grown up together. Father tending the sheep up on the hills and Sandir escaping from his rigorous education to join him. Sandir had been raised from birth to take over from his father, and his father before him, as the caretaker of the land from the old wood, all the way down to the town of Baril on the coast. Nura watched the three of them go into the reception room where a fire was already blazing and closed the door behind them. Beor lay down in the hallway in front of the door and stared at Nura. The front reception room was for guests only, and children were not allowed. What had been in father's letter? Nura wondered idly as she heard her mother's muffled voice and Sandir's deep laugh from the room down the hall. There was a clang of pots from the kitchen opposite. Mira had begun to prepare lunch. Eager to avoid being roped into helping, Nura and Pin ran upstairs to their room where they play-wrestled for a short while, then lay on the bed and watched rain drum against the window, waiting for the weather to clear. As soon as the rain stopped, Nura and Pin were down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out into the yard, leaving Mira calling for them to come back and help.
I'll collect flowers for the table,
Nura shouted over her shoulder, and Pin squeaked happily as they ran around the back of the house. Come on, Pin, Nura laughed. Let's go see what's good in Mother's garden. A pale, dry stone wall ran around the boundary of the property, about 20 paces from the house, enclosing her mother's pride and joy. A maze of stone paths, herb beds, fruit trees, and flowers which wrapped around the north, west, and south sides of the family home. Pin's heightened sense of smell mingled with her own, and the scent of wet grass, pears, and rosemary enveloped her. They made their way slowly together, winding between the flower beds, taking as long as they could to look for aster and amarene blooms, the only ones to be in flower at this time of year this high in the hill country. Eventually they found some on the south side of the house, near the open reception room window. Steward Sandir's voice came from inside, tight and exasperated. But that still doesn't explain why you would want to leave. To leave what your family has built over generations. Nura froze, crouched next to the flower bed. She knew this was a conversation she should not be listening to. A cold tightness gripped her stomach, but she didn't dare move. Try to understand, Sandir, Father's voice replied, equally tense. This is not something we take lightly. We have spoken of this many times, and true, I was resistant before. But now you have lost your reason. All because you have met a Ruhari boy in the woods, Sandir retorted. There was a heavy silence. Then Sandir continued quieter. I am sorry, Alith. It is just a lot for me to take in. Hita, surely you are not for this. I am a wool merchant's daughter, Sandir, her mother replied firmly. I grew up in the towns. I have seen what we are becoming. Our people need this. They need to remember what we are here to do. The fire crackled and there was a creaking of floorboards followed by slow footsteps. From where Nura was crouched, she could see Sandir's head bob past the window as he paced the floor. I don't deny that it is admirable, noble even, Sandir said, and then turned to look out the window. Nura tried to press herself in closer to the wall. I suppose in the end, he continued, I just hate to lose such good friends. Nura could see his eyes flicking back and forth across the horizon. My friend, her father said as he stood to join Sandir at the window. It pains us too, but we cannot just sit by, not when there could be hope. Sandir nodded, then turned to her father. Well, what can I say against that? You were always a better man than me, Alith. Sandir grasped her father's shoulders firmly. You can count on me to find the right people. Your family's farm will pass into good hands, and your father's legacy will continue to grow. On that, you have my word. I have no doubt, her father replied with a smile. Then there was a knock at the door. Nura heard Mira announce that lunch was ready, and there was the sound of more footsteps as the adults left the room, and the door creaked and then clicked shut. What was that, Pin? Nura breathed, wide-eyed. Pin looked back up at her, not understanding anything that had been said, but feeling the panic radiating from Nura through the bond. Pin whined and licked Nura's hand. Nura, lunch! Mother called from the kitchen door. Nura's mind raced as she walked back around to the yard. They were going to leave. They were going to lose their home? Tumbling waves of emotion swept over her, each one stronger than the last. Everyone was already sitting at the table when Nura walked in, helping themselves to their lunch from plates of smoked meats, cheese, and fruit, and talking as if the world had not just shifted under their feet. Nura stood in the doorway, taking short, sharp breaths, and unable to stop the tears from welling in her eyes. Her mother was the first to notice. Nura, dear, what's wrong? She asked, face creased with worry. Nura couldn't hold back the tears. They began to flow freely, her heart drumming in her ears. Why? She managed to say between heavy sobs which racked her little body. Why are we leaving? Her parents looked at each other, eyes wide with shock. Nura, you weren't supposed to... Her father began, then stopped, searching for the right words as her mother came over and held her close. What is she talking about, Da? Yael asked, suddenly anxious. This is not the way we wanted to tell you. The father sighed and shook his head. Your mother and I feel it would be right for us all to join the pilgrimage north. The words rang in Nura's ears like the heavy tolling of a large bell. The pilgrimage was something she had heard adults talk about from time to time, but only in passing. She felt like she was going to be sick. But who will protect the fruit trees? She asked in a panic. The Sanhi brothers will take all the cherries. I know they will. And Mother, what about your garden? Nura's tears were hot with anger now. There was nothing right about any of this. Why do we have to leave? It's not fair! The last word burst out of her as she pushed her mother off, then ran crying into the hall and up the stairs. She banged open her bedroom door and flung herself under her bed, grabbing the covers as she did so and piling them tight about her. She sobbed into them as she listened to the voices from down below, then shortly to the sound of her father's footsteps coming up the stairs. Her door opened, and she could see her father's feet as he walked into the room. Nura? He asked gently. Then, when she didn't answer, he lay on the floor on his stomach and crossed his arms under his head as he looked at her. Thought I would find you under here, he said. Why don't you come out and we can talk about it? Nura frowned at him and shook her head, then buried her face in her covers again. For a long while they were both silent. Then Father asked her, What do you want to know? The simple question surprised her. At the back of her mind, behind the tides of emotions, curiosity danced and flickered. What was the pilgrimage? Who was the Ruhari boy in the woods? Hope for what? After a moment of thinking, she crawled out from under her bed, and Father sat up as she climbed onto his lap. "Why do we have to leave?" she asked quietly. "You remember how our people came to these lands, Nura?" her father replied, and Nura nodded. "We came on great ships, hundreds of years ago, to bring the peace to the wilderness, to the animals through the bond, and to the land through them." "Exactly," her father replied. "And how well do you think we have done?" Nura thought for a moment. "I don't know. Good, I think. Pin is happy, and Beor, and our fruit trees grow well, and you help in the old wood." "And beyond our lands?" Father asked. "I don't know. There are the Uldir Mountains, and then... I don't know." "And then the lands of the Ruhari. Those lands do not know the peace, Nura. The people there are at constant war with themselves, and the land suffers for it. They cannot even form the bond," her father said, then frowned. "Or at least, they have not yet learnt to form the bond."
Nura was silent for a moment,
then asked a question of her own. "I heard Sandir say you met a Ruhari boy in the woods. Do we have to go because of him?" "Yes and no," her father said. "He showed me something. That perhaps there is hope yet for his people."
Nura was quiet for a long while, then asked in a small voice,
"Do we really have to go? Can't someone else do it?"
"Maybe, dear one,"
Father smiled. "But we can. So we should. If there is a chance for us to bring the peace through the work of our hands, we should take it." Nura's heart sank like a stone. They really were going to leave, and there was no way around it. When Father started quoting the Book of Wisdom, there was no changing his mind. She felt like she could weep for days, but her tears had all dried up and her head throbbed, so she simply lay there silent in her father's lap, grieving all the places and things and people she was to leave behind. Out of the whole family, Yael seemed to take the news the best. His eyes would shine as he asked Father 100 questions about the journey ahead and the world beyond their farm. Father would smile and answer the questions if he could, but most of his waking hours were consumed by preparations, planning provisions, building a wagon, and interviewing the families hopeful to take over their farm. Mother and Dal seemed to struggle more.
As winter drew on, Nura would often see her mother stop in the garden mid-stride and look about with sad eyes.
Dal would wake up most nights fearful of losing his toys or being left behind. Nura dealt with the loss the best way she knew how. She spent more time than usual out in the orchards with Pin, trying to soak up a sense of the bare branches and gray sky of the land sleeping before spring. She wondered if they would see the cherry blossoms before they had to leave. "What are we going to do, Pin?" she would ask almost daily with a sigh as she looked out over the east road, tracing the path they would take down into the lowlands and then out into the world beyond. The rest of the winter passed slowly for Nura, with many lonely hours spent trapped inside by heavy snowfall while Father finished the wagon and Mother smoked the last of the meat and pickled the winter vegetables. The only reprieve came with a visit from the Farney family, the ones selected by Father to take over the farm. They seemed nice enough, and they had a daughter, Galna, who was about Nura's age. Nura resolved to teach her all the tasks and responsibilities of the future protector of the orchards. It simply would not do for her replacement to be ill-equipped in taking up her battle against the Sandhit brothers. The first thaw came earlier than expected, and the world of frozen white became green once more, then speckled with yellow as early spring flowers dotted the meadows. Nura watched them sway in the breeze from her bedroom window. It was the morning of her final day at home, and she sat for a long while, dangling her feet off the edge of her bed while Pin chewed at her hand playfully. She struggled to imagine a life beyond these walls, beyond this land that had raised her. "Time to go!" Father's voice echoed from below, and Nura heard the clatter of Yael rushing past her bedroom door and down the stairs. Nura sighed, then stood. "Come on, Pin," she said, and Pin jumped up into her arms. They left together, letting the bedroom door click closed behind them. and descended into the flurry of last-minute preparations. Mother carried a quiet doll on her hip while she packed the last few jars and some breads into a hamper. Mira was rushing back and forth, taking packs out into the yard where Hal was helping Father and Yale hitch the wagon to Hanat. The young Shire horse shook his head and snorted, comfortably testing his strength against the wagon's weight. Within a few minutes, the last supplies were loaded. Nura and Dal were lifted into the back of the wagon, and they were all saying their goodbyes. Hal pressed Father's hand to his forehead, and Mira came over to give Nura a teary kiss and a tight squeeze. "You're a good girl, Nura," she said. "You keep the rest of them out of trouble, okay?" Nura smiled weakly in reply, unable to find the right words. It still did not feel real somehow that this was likely the last time she would see them, or her home. Pin jumped up into the wagon and sat beside Nura as it lurched into motion. Together they watched from beneath the tarp covering as they rumbled out of the farm and turned west, slowly heading down towards the lowlands. The farm and its fields sank gradually from view, obscured by the rising crest of the hill behind them. After the last tip of the chimney had disappeared from view, Nura closed the tarp flap and lay down next to Dal in the bed of the wagon. The wagon rocked, and the wheels creaked as they moved slowly along, and, with nothing else to do, Nura and Dal drifted off into a fitful sleep. It was nearly noon when Father shook Nura's shoulder. Bright sunlight shone in through the open tarp flap, dazzling her.
"Sorry to wake you, sweet one," he whispered, "but I thought you would want to see this."
She noticed that they had stopped moving. Groggy and sticky with sweat, Nura took her father's hand and climbed up from the humid heat of the wagon, squinting against the daylight as Pin jumped down next to her. A cool spring breeze blew in refreshing gusts, and the air was filled with a floral scent, one both sweet and familiar. As Nura's eyes adjusted, she took in the scene about them. She gasped. A dancing sea of orange stretched for miles in all directions, fields upon fields of wild Garthia blooms, and in the far distance was the sea, sparkling silver and blue.
"It's beautiful,"
Nura breathed. She had never dreamed she would ever see so many at once, that she could be so thoroughly enveloped amongst her favorite flowers. Their sweet scent was almost overwhelming. Father stood beside her, squeezing her to his side, and then breathed deeply as he looked out over the landscape.
"Just look at that,"
he said, and with a sigh, "I'm glad I get to share this with you." And for the first time in a long while, Nura was glad too.
Know you, Father, where my head might rest, whilst we wander far from birth and bed. Whisper, mother, soft as lonesome trees, why abandon orchards such as these? Will the ages suffer